I'm Cierra Bettens. This is APTN News InFocus. Today on the show, what's in and what's out of Budget 2025.
And Canada's new government's core mission, our mandate, is to empower Canadians by building Canada's economic strengths. That's how, in uncertain times, we will create greater certainty, greater security, and greater prosperity for all Canadians.
Mark Carney labelled Budget 2025, his first as Prime Minister, as a generational budget, a bold response to put Canada on the correct path during difficult times. With nearly $90 billion in new spending, the plan is, as most budgets do, getting mixed reviews. But what exactly is generational or bold about this budget? And what's in it for First Nations, Métis, and Inuit in Canada? Karyn Pugliese is APTN's online correspondent in Ottawa and the host of our political show, Nation to Nation. And she joins me on InFocus to help us read between the lines of this 493-page budget and to discuss what it means for Indigenous peoples. So Karyn, $90 billion in new spending in this budget. What's in it for First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people?
There wasn't much that was actually a new announcement. There was $2.3 billion for clean water for First Nations. Now, that's important because the Trudeau government had promised to end all boil water advisories in First Nations, and they didn't meet that goal. So this is a continuance of that. And then there's $1 billion for Arctic infrastructure, but it comes with kind of a caveat. So this is for transportation mostly. They're looking at like deep water ports and four-season roads, but it's something called like a dual use. And I've been told that this is a phrase we're going to have to get used to under the Carney government. Dual use, triple use, multi-use is that when they go to build something or they go to spend money, it's not just going to have one purpose. So there's two purposes. These roads, these ports, this infrastructure is going to serve local communities, but also be for the military.
Interesting. What does that kind of signal to you?
Well, I mean, this is like Mark Carney has been doing nothing but talking about his plan for Canada's economy. You know, to recap, and I think by now people know this, there's a certain president of the United States who's been very protectionist and has put up tariffs against many countries across the world, one of whom is Canada. And it's really changed our thinking about the economy and trading with the U.S. It shows how much power, because most of our trade is with U.S., that economy, when they make a decision, can have on ours. And so, of course, Carney has been looking for new trading partners. And he's talked about making Canada an energy superpower. And he's also been talking about protecting our sovereignty, which is kind of interesting. And so this is a budget very different from a Trudeau-era budget where Trudeau was very focused on reconciliation and really just serving First Nations communities. There's stuff in there for First Nations, Métis, and Inuit communities. But, you know, it is really primarily an unfolding of Carney's economic vision. And what is in there for Indigenous people is how we fit into that economic vision.
Mm-hmm. And so on Nation to Nation, economist Kevin Page spoke about how this budget was different. Can you talk a bit about, you know, what he said was different and what he meant by that?
Yeah, I mean, that was a big part of it. He talked about dual use, triple use, multi-use, spending. He also said, that just in the layout, one of the things he noticed, and Fraser Needham, my colleague here in Ottawa, and I noticed it too when we were in lockup, is that often when you go through the budget, there's a section on Indigenous peoples. And there's sort of a vision laid out for what the nation-to-nation relationship is going to look at and how the government is going to meet that. That is not the case in this budget. I mean, there is no chapter on Indigenous peoples. The announcements of money were sort of laid into other chapters. And honestly, I had to go through and keyword search the budget. One of the things in lockup, they give you the hard copy. And these days, they thankfully give you a PDF. And so I was just doing that Control F and searching Indigenous, Métis, and Inuit to make sure that I captured everything. So, I mean, basically what he was saying is that there was stuff in there for First Nations, but really this is a signal that we are folding in First Nations into Canada. Like, he felt very much that Carney's vision is to create that, quote, one Canadian economy, and he means it, and Indigenous people are going to fit inside that vision of what the Canadian economy is.
Yeah, and, on a similar vein to that, I think with this budget and leading up to this budget, we've seen the Carney government use this language of sovereignty and Canadian sovereignty. And I know we talked about this before, but in the context of this budget, how does that match up with Indigenous sovereignty, or, is that considered at all in this budget?
It wasn't. And if you listen to the ITK, that was one of their criticisms when he's talking about the Arctic-specific infrastructure and, sovereignty. There's no language about consulting with Inuit people or, how Inuit self-determination fits in with it. It's really just Carney talking about, sovereignty, boosting the military, and there isn't that sort of warm reconciliation feel to it. There wasn't even, if I could, we hear the term economic reconciliation passed around a lot. Like we've heard those words as being the Mark Carney government's approach to reconciliation. And certainly they said a lot in speech leading up to the budget, in the speech from the throne. Whenever he's talked about Bill C-5, the One Canadian Economy Act, he has talked about this idea of, Indigenous people are going to prosper from this. And, we probably will prosper from the vision, but there hasn't been a lot about a nation-to-nation vision. The one thing that I did notice is when Carney's been pushed on questions by Indigenous leaders, like, what if we don't agree to some of these energy projects that you've got going through? What if 4 communities agree and 1 doesn't? What are you going to do? He's kind of sidestepped those questions and said, people aren't going to disagree. We're only going to do projects where, there's full support of them. He spoke to Dennis Ward on the national news. Mark Carney told him they had so many Indigenous people coming forward to him with so many ideas for how they want to develop their economies in conjunction with this plan. He didn't name names. I don't know who these communities are. There probably are some, I have no doubt. But he really has sidestepped the questions of free, prior, and informed consent. And that wording was actually in this budget. And it's the first time I've kind of seen it plainly said by the Carney government.
I want to move back to something that you brought up earlier. So, the budget earmarked $1 billion for the Arctic. What's that going towards?
Yeah, so it's $1 billion over 4 years, and it's to support Arctic transportation infrastructure. So these are deep water ports, airstrips, sea lift facilities, all-season roads. And like I said, they're designed for both military and civilian use. And this is a little bit responding to an ask that the Inuit made. You remember the Prime Minister held a summit with First Nations in Ottawa, but he also held summits with the Métis Nation and with Inuit representatives from across Inuit territories. And that was one of the things that they walked in with, is they walked in with a list of infrastructure where they said, if you're going to develop the North, you're not going to be able to get much done in the North unless you address the airstrips, unless you address, the roads and the infrastructures. So apparently he heard that. But like I said, it is this dual use.
Mm-hmm. And we also know that some of the money in the budget is going to the Indigenous Advisory Council. Can you talk a bit about, what that consists of and how much money is going towards that?
But they didn't carve that out. So they've got a large amount of money going into the Major Projects Office. It's $213.8 million over 5 years. And of that, $19.8 million will be reallocated from within existing departments. So it's not all new money. And then it just says some of the funding will support the Indigenous Advisory Council, which, the council only meets a couple of times a year. It's not a full-time body that's sitting there, from my understanding, and we still know very little about what that Indigenous Advisory Council is supposed to do. and it was not spelled out what their functionality is in the budget. It's just kind of this high level, they're going to be there to advise, they're going to be there to help, but practically what they do is not really spelled out.
Mm-hmm. And is there anything else in particular that really stood out to you as you were going through the budget for the first time?
Yeah, I mean, like, one of the things that I did notice is really some of the gaps in between what was asked for and what was given. You know, the national chief had asked for $362 billion over 5 years to close the infrastructure gap. And in that money, there was $26.7 billion for education. Now, we didn't necessarily see that money in the budget exactly or is new. But what happened is, in the back of the budget, as you're kind of going through, since the last economic statement that was in fall of 2024, of course, this government has been functioning without like a written planned budget. It's just kind of continuing. And one of the things that they did is they noticed that there were several areas where they needed to add some money in. And so they had added in $155 million for K-12 and post-secondary since fall 2024 for First Nations. And they also put in $2.17 billion in program top-ups. So that was some infrastructure. You know, they put $1 million into Jordan's Principle. There's a very long list. And we've got like the full list up on the website at aptnnews.ca if anybody wants to check that out. But it adds up to basically like that $2.17 billion in program top-ups. And that is a really far way from the $362 billion that the AFN asked for. I think the other thing that everybody talked about was the zeros. And what we mean by the zeros is when usually there's multi-year funding. And so you remember that, well, even with the water, right? Like the $2.3 billion that they put in for clean water spread over 3 years. So there's a lot of programs that are sunsetting that were promised under the last government, the Trudeau government, that are going to come up for renewal. But when you look ahead in the budget, there's money this year, and down the next column, it's 0, 0, 0. So what's going to happen? And we're not sure. You know, I talked to the Indigenous Services Minister, and she said, don't worry about it. She's going to go out and consult. And, you know, she kind of talked about talking to First Nations leaders about what their visions were for their communities to make sure that the outcomes were going to be right. She didn't promise me that it was going to translate into money in next year's budget. So there's a lot of programs that are just kind of trickling along this year that we don't know if they're going to continue. ITK, Inuit Kanatami, flagged one. They have an Inuit child services program, and it's kind of the Inuit-specific version of Jordan's Principle. And that one, for example, is just one program off the top of my head because they flagged it, that's up for renewal in 2026. And they were surprised at the zeros in the future budget and said, well, are you renewing this program? Are you not renewing this program? What's going on with it? And they want to go talk to the minister about it, and I am sure that they will. I asked the minister about it, and I'll just be frank. If you watch Nation to Nation, I asked her about it twice, and she didn't really give me a straight answer. She talked more about consulting and looking at holistic programming going forward. So I do know that one of the non-monetary things they talked about in this budget for the North was about doing, a multi-minister review, like getting several departments involved to go up in the North and look at the Northern healthcare system and see what's missing. So it sounds like they want to study it before they make any kind of commitments. And I got no commitments out of her beyond the fact that they were going to study it.
Mm-hmm. So, before I let you go, Karyn, I'm wondering, what do you think our listeners should be watching for as this budget unfolds in the next year? What are, some signs maybe to look out for, some policies? How do you think this is all going to play out?
Yeah, so I think a few things. I mean, one of the things to mention that was a reassurance from the minister is all departments were supposed to be cut by 15%. And Indigenous Services Canada and the Indigenous Crown Relation Department were only cut by 2%. And she says that gives certainty that programs in communities are going to continue. But there's no building on them, right? Like, I mean, I asked her, I said, we have and have not communities out there. So what do you say to the have-nots? And she was, well, services are going to continue and they could be reassured. But I'm certain that if I talk to chiefs in those have-not communities, the problem is not continuity of services, but that they don't have enough. So I expect to hear some debate between leaders and the minister over the next year. I think on the more positive side, when I spoke to the MMF, the Manitoba Métis Federation, they were actually kind of hopeful. There were a couple of things that they liked in there. One of them was that there was leftover money from past years for housing, and Budget 2025 confirmed that $2.8 billion would remain allocated for urban, rural, and northern Indigenous housing. And that's money that the Métis can access. They could have clawed that back. They didn't. So that was good news for the Métis. It was interesting because Fraser interviewed the Métis National Council, and they were disappointed that some of the funding in here for infrastructure and in the context of just economic development wasn't specifically earmarked for Métis. But when I talked to the MMF, they said that didn't bother them. They were happy the Churchill project was going forward, and they said they were going to benefit from that. And they didn't necessarily look through the budget looking for the word Métis. They just kind of know that they are going to generally benefit from the growing of the Canadian economy and really the saving of the Canadian economy if the US pushes back really hard on us. And so I think another thing to look for is how that money that isn't necessarily specifically earmarked for Indigenous people, to their point, actually gets spread out. Just because it's not earmarked as development money specifically for Indigenous people, is there still a way for Indigenous people to benefit from it or to access it if they participate in some of these major projects?
Karyn, thanks so much again for joining us.
Oh, thank you for having me. Always a pleasure.
Karyn Pugliese is the host of APTN's political show, Nation to Nation. Prime Minister Carney also promised that people would be seeing a strong climate strategy in the budget. He is, after all, the author of Values, a book on how the economy and the environment should work together. And while some praise the budget for having a climate vision, the David Suzuki Foundation has some concerns. Lisa Gu is the foundation's national policy manager, and she joins me to share what this budget means for the environment. Thanks so much for joining us, Lisa.
My pleasure.
So the Suzuki Foundation's post-budget statement says that the federal budget gets some things right, but that Canada won't meet its climate goals or build long-term economic resilience by doubling down on fossil fuels. So I want to start on a more positive note. What does the budget get right?
Well, let me start by saying that it's not every budget that has included a chapter or a section titled the Climate Competitiveness Strategy. And we certainly do welcome the clear statement in that section of the budget that action to tackle climate change is both a moral and an economic imperative. So that's a very helpful orientation for the budget, which is positioned as an investment budget, but also the government's agenda more broadly. I think it is seen in its best light. It's a strong signal that the government acknowledges that its Build Canada agenda needs to be anchored in climate action and sustainability measures that will ensure that we're building a sustainable Canada. So there's some good detail in there as well, and we can get to that. But I do need to just say from the outset too that despite that chapter on the climate competitiveness strategy, overall the budget sends mixed messages because it also revives a subsidy for LNG, liquefied natural gas, and fails to really address the need to rein in fossil fuel emissions if we're going to really be climate competitive. There's also a big gap in this year's budget, which is funding for nature, as the major funding for 5-year funding envelope is about to run out of money, and we have yet to see any indication of refinancing for that important agenda.
And I want to get your thoughts on this language of climate competitiveness, and that including LNG and critical minerals. Is there a sense, do you think, that the government is trying to shift the narrative a bit with that language?
It's a mistake. I mean, we can't pretend to be positioning Canada's economy to be climate competitive, anchored in the fossil fuels that cause climate change. We really need to be talking about putting the emphasis on developing clean technologies, clean fuels, clean electricity, and doing so in a way that is firmly committed to protecting and restoring nature along the way as well. A healthy environment is fundamental for Canada's long-term prosperity, and short-sighted industrial policies, economic policies that sacrifice the environment for ostensibly for short-term economic gain will ultimately only increase the costs for future generations, costs in terms of climate impacts, and also the fact that the longer we wait to reduce emissions, the more costly emission reductions become.
And I was wondering if you could speak a bit more to the nature funding that's set to run out. Can you talk a bit about what that funding covers and the consequences that you foresee as a result of the end to those programs?
Yeah, there was a major investment dubbed the Enhanced Nature Legacy in Budget 2021, which does carry through till the end of March 2026. So there's still time for the government to reinvest, but it is worrying that in a budget that puts a lot of emphasis on major projects, resource development, it really didn't have much to say about protecting nature as part of that agenda, and no assurances at all around extending funding for the broad base of funding for achieving Canada's goals around halting and reversing nature loss. So that includes vital funding for Indigenous guardian programs, Indigenous-led conservation as well. I want to remain optimistic that sometime between now and the end of March, the government will make an announcement around refunding, reinvesting in those programs. But normally the budget is where we would have expected to see that, and there wasn't any indication there at all.
And another thing I was noticing in the budget was the government is also rolling back greenwashing legislation, saying it's creating more confusion and investment uncertainty. What does this signal to you?
Yeah, very worrying. There's actually 3 legislative changes announced with the budget that amount to weakening of environmental standards and oversight, and that's one of them. This relates to recent changes that were brought to the Competition Act to specify prohibitions on essentially false advertising when it comes to environmental claims. So we have yet to see, all we have is really like a one-line description of the legislation being proposed, or the amendments to that legislation that will be proposed. We have yet to see the detail. It's too bad if that important provision is gutted, and hopefully the changes will still retain the essence of that prohibition, because clearly false advertising when it comes to environmental claims is just like any other false advertising. It does a disservice to consumers and to the public. And I'll just highlight one of the other changes that I'm also very worried about, legislative changes that's proposed in the budget. It would remove post-market, the legal obligation for post-market reevaluations of pesticides. We can't, it would be patently irresponsible to move to a system where chemicals, once approved, are essentially permanently authorized for use in Canada. We know that the science, it frequently happens that during a post-market review, scientific or environmental monitoring information that was not available at the time of the initial registration comes to light that results in restrictions to protect the environment and to protect human health. So again, I have yet to see the details of what's being proposed. It's a very concerning proposal. It would seem to be a significant walk back on Canada's environmental standards.
So you mentioned earlier with nature funding that, the Indigenous-led conservation could be implicated in that. And I was wondering if you could speak a bit more to how this budget and, these environmental cuts complicate or compromise the government's commitments to Indigenous peoples.
Well, that's a really big question, and I'll maybe just tackle it more narrowly from the perspective of that nature funding. And I do want to clarify that it hasn't been cut per se. It's just that an explicit cut to that program has not yet been communicated. It's just that the existing funding will run out at the end of March. And this week's budget did not reinvest in nature. So we are maintaining our call for the government to pay attention to that important budget item and ensure new funding is confirmed before the end of March when the existing funding envelope runs out. So that funding supported a wide range of programming that is intended to position Canada to achieve all of its commitments under the Global Biodiversity Framework. That includes protecting the 30% of land and ocean by 2030, which is a target that the Prime Minister has reinforced both in his election platform and then later we saw it in protecting more nature being highlighted as part of the speech from the throne. It takes resources and the government needs to put its money where its mouth is, quite literally in this case. But yes, in one of the important programs that funding supports is Indigenous-led conservation initiatives, Indigenous guardianship arrangements across Canada. And certainly we hope to see that kind of work, that kind of partnership work continue and not be held back. It's a really unfortunate situation that the funding for nature is being left in limbo in this budget. Because I think everybody involved needs certainty, needs confirmation that of funding levels and continuity in order to plan for it. We're talking about permanent protection as a goal. It's a mismatch with the uncertainty around long-term funding at this point.
Mm-hmm. Another thing I noticed is that the government is planning to integrate AI into its departmental operations, and I'm wondering, what are the environmental implications of that?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't think that has been fully assessed at all. The budget wasn't very specific in terms of exactly how AI will be applied in all respects. But definitely it is important for all budget initiatives to be measured from an environmental perspective. And I think that is work that has yet to be done.
Before I let you go, Lisa, I just want to ask, what are some of the long-term consequences of not investing in climate? And, how will future generations be affected by this budget?
Well, I want to believe that the government means what it says in the climate competitiveness strategy that was part of this budget, and that investing in climate action is both a moral and an economic responsibility and necessity. The costs of climate change are mounting, and the longer we delay, the more costs we're imposing on future generations. So I think this budget, sends some hopeful signals. There are some regulatory measures and now confirmed in the budget that if implemented well and swiftly could go a long way to reducing Canada's emissions, and also some big contradictions, as we've discussed, when it comes to the place of fossil fuels in a climate competitive economy. Watch this space. The jury is out, I guess, in terms of how what the government will really prioritize and whether or not Canada will, in this week as the Global Climate Summit gets going in Brazil, whether this budget meets the moment in terms of the imperative for climate action.
Lisa, thanks so much for taking the time and joining us on InFocus.
My pleasure. Thanks for the opportunity.
Lisa Gu is the National Policy Manager at the David Suzuki Foundation. This episode was produced by Mark Blackburn and edited by Jesse Andrushko. Charmaine Straker is the executive producer of APTN News InFocus. We want to know if you're enjoying the show. Please leave a rating and review on your favorite player, or email suggestions to infocus@aptn.ca. Also, give us a follow. It helps other people find the show. I'm Cierra Bettens. Thanks for listening. Talk to you next week.
Homeless people aren't hard to find in Winnipeg. They're on the sidewalks, in bus shelters, and down alleyways. They're living in tents and squatting in empty buildings. They're even sleeping in abandoned cars. But who are they? And why are they here? Find out in Our Relatives, Life on the Streets, hosted by me, Kathleen Martins. Listen on your favorite podcast player.